Everyone, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk a little bit about the Queen's Gambit, in particular the Queen's Gambit Declined, and a concept which a lot of players I find just don't really understand. And it's pertaining to this sort of capture c takes d5, where people are sort of aiming to get into this Carlsbad structure. However, flipping the board briefly, I'm going to show a game of my own, but first I want to really take a look at this from a first principles sort of perspective. Like, what is the purpose of taking on d5? Like, yes, after e takes d5, you get this sort of Carlsbad structure, but you really have to think about, like, what are you giving black? Because obviously when you release a tension like this, you are giving up something in some sort of way or form. And when black recaptures, the most obvious thing that sort of occurs in this change of structure is that black's light squared bishop is now free to come to this sort of diagonal. And so basically what this means is that if white does not take any sort of direct action at this sort of plan that black may pursue with developing their light squared bishop very freely, then black is just going to equalize out of the opening very easily, and white's whole opening concept is kind of questionable. And the following game is a very good example of that. This was played at my sort of local club. It was a rapid tournament, and I was playing this guy who was right around like 1600, maybe 1700 nationally. He opened with one knight f3, I went d5, c4, e6, and if white wants to sort of keep the game in sort of ready territory, he could play g3, he could play e3, or if you want to transpose to more d4 territory, you could play d4. And my opponent tried to transpose to d4 territory and maybe a Queen's Gambit Declined exchange variation by playing c takes d5, takes, and d4. However, again, there was sort of an issue in that he wasn't really thinking about why he was making these moves. Why am I playing c takes d5? He just sort of was like, okay, I take, I do this, and after knight f6, knight c3, I play c6, and after bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, I play bishop f5. And note how I'm just not playing autopilot moves. I'm not just playing knight b7, e3, like, oh, this is a Queen's Gambit Decline, this is what I do. I am actively making use of the sort of drawback in my opponent's move order, where I now develop my light squared bishop outside the pawn chain, take control of this diagonal, and I'm able to develop all my pieces very harmoniously in this position. Also note when white plays bishop d3, this is another benefit of having the bishop on f5, that now I managed to trade off my so-called, like, bad bishop, since, you know, my pawns are in light squares, and also white's sort of good bishop, right? And the game continued bishop e7, castles, castles, a3, a5, and he tried to pursue like sort of minority attack plan on the queen side. But already one drawback which I want you guys to take note of is that when white's going for this whole b4 thing, they are inherently creating sort of weaknesses in the light squares, in particular the c4 square comes to mind. And when you've already traded off, for example, your light squared bishop, these weaknesses are further sort of exacerbated, you could argue. But in the game I end up playing knight e4, a very typical like jump that you play in the Queen's Gambit Declined, where after bishop takes e7, he played bishop g4 in the game, but if he takes, I take back, and it's very difficult to deal with the knight on e4, because if you take, this is a fork, and if you say try to play something like b4 in this position, one sort of plan I could pursue is something like a takes b4, a takes b4, and maybe b5, again just clamping down the light squares, and I could perhaps try to play something like knight b6, knight c4, again making use of the sort of weak light squares I was just talking about. I could also maybe throw in something like after a takes b4, rook a3, and just sort of make use of the awkward coordination right now. But I think actually I have to be a little bit careful as well, because I think tactically this might fail due to knight takes d5, when after e takes d5, queen takes a3, and of course if rook takes d3, knight takes e7 check, and white's actually up a pawn. But nonetheless, by this point black was doing more than fine. But again, in large part this was due to the fact that white was very careless in their move order. They allowed black to get their light squared bishop out with absolutely no cost to it, and then furthermore, after the following moves, they allowed us to trade off their good bishop. Somewhat more ambitious could technically be bishop e2, but again, like then this bishop is just standing on a very annoying square in this diagonal. You can never even play rook b1, b4 going for minority attack, because this bishop is being a big pain in the ass. So with that all in mind, what really is the correct move order then? And the correct move order, as some of you may know, is to play knight c3, knight f6, and then take on d5, takes, now bishop g5. And the whole point that you need to take into consideration now is that it is much more difficult for black to really freely get out their light squared bishop. For example, they try to do so immediately. Now queen b3 really hits hard, hitting the d5 guy and also the b7 pawn. Or alternatively, you could even take on f6 first, and if they take for the queen, you lose a pawn. And if you take for the pawn, you still lose a pawn. But what I find kind of wild in this position is I look in the database, literally the most popular move in this position is to go e3. Like, people just don't even understand this at all. They don't understand, like, why they're taking on d5, the drawback behind doing so. They learn some theory in an opening book. They're like, okay, black, like, develops like this. They close in light squared bishop in, they castle, and I go for some sort of plan like either with the minority attack, or I go for one of these setups where I put a knight on e2 instead and go for the f3 e4 break in the center. But these move orders are so important, and really understanding again like not only the move orders but why they actually work, because a lot of people play the right move order but then they get to this position like the one we were just looking at, but this one's another good example where fortunately this time the most popular move actually is the best one, but like according to the Lichess database, this one isn't even played 50% of the time. It's queen f3, right? Where we basically attack the bishop, and if they move it, now we give them doubled f pawns, and technically this is a theoretical variation. Some players at the top level, they play it when they just want to make a draw, but you know, obviously you are in the back foot giving yourself doubled f pawns so early on in the game, but I just think it's a shame again that so many players don't really understand this. They might play something like bishop d3 in the position, the second most popular move, when again you just trade off the light squared bishops and now black has a completely fine game. You've given your opponent absolutely no problems. And so coming back to like the whole thing we saw in the last game, the reason why like this whole move order, if you go knight f3 first and then try to take on d5, is nowhere near as good, is that say now if you try to go for a similar thing, right? If we go for the line that I showed with h6, bishop h4, bishop f5, now if white plays queen b3, this almost sort of works. Like for example, with queen b6 in this position, I should note you don't want to play b6 as black. This is very weakening. In particular, when I say weakening, like take note of the c6 guy. If white, for example, plays knight e5 in this position, it's very awkward to develop your knight now because c6 is hanging, which is why like probably the more logical move is to go for something like queen b6. But like in this case, white can at least give black double pawns, and there is sort of something to play for. Like maybe white even has a bit of an advantage. But the concrete issue is that in this position, and like I'm not telling you to memorize this is just what I sort of had planned going into this game. Okay, when I say had planned, that makes it sound like it was a classical game. Again, it was a rapid game, but this was sort of knowledge I had beforehand that if queen b3, I could play this very precise move g5, and now if bishop g3, queen b6, and compared to the other variation, there's no bishop takes f6 action going on, and if they take, well, I'm not at all worried about this. This structure is very desirable for black. Here we have the rook on the open a file going to work. b5, b4 could be coming next, kicking this knight away. Not really too much for white to really write home about in this position. And also you may sort of be asking what happens if they take on b7 after g5, but this actually is a very cool line where you play g takes h4, you sacrifice the exchange, you play queen b6, and the queen is actually in a lot of trouble on this b7 square. Sorry, a8 rather. So coming full circle, really why this whole variation worked again is that the drawback of playing c takes d5, again, is that the light squared bishop can get out, but when you play this very quick knight c3 bishop g5, there's adequate pressure on d5 to the point that it's very difficult for black to get their light squared bishop out so early in the game, which means that black is often forced to go for something a bit more passive, where white will now get out their light squared bishop and they're forced to again go for some sort of setup with like a knight in d7, and only then later on in the game again to develop this bishop. Which is not to say, of course, this is like a terrible position for black. It's not. This is a mainstream theoretical opening, but it's important to get the move order right, because in this position you can pose some serious trouble to your opponent, whereas in like this one, where if you just exchange light squared bishops, zero problems for your opponent, they're going to be happy. And don't get me wrong, right? This is still a game of chess. You could maybe outplay your opponent, but why make your opponent's life 10 times more easy for no reason? Just going over some other scenarios in which I've sort of found myself in over the years, where it's clear to me that people just don't really understand this concept of like when to time this whole c takes d5 thing. For one, we can talk a little bit about the Catalan Opening, where, I mean, of course, this is an opening that I'm a big fan of. I've made quite a bit of content on this, where after castles, castle c6. I found that a lot of people, they just don't really understand this position. They might play something like c takes d5. The correct approach is to play something like queen c2, knight d2, and go e4. By playing c takes d5, there's a couple issues. One is that after e takes d5, again, we're in this sort of Carlsbad structure where black can get their light squared bishop outside the pawn chain very easily, instead of having to sort of do things very slowly with b6, bishop b7. And moreover, also in this one in particular, the bishop is just very bad in this diagonal, so it's slamming its head against the d5 pawn. But this sort of capture would be more justified if we say wait a move, maybe we play something like knight c3, b6, and now c takes d5, because again, this sort of structure, now if they play e takes d5, this guy's very weak because they've played this move b6, and if they play c takes d5, I mean, this is just sort of a game is the way I see it. It's sort of a symmetrical structure. Probably again though not the most ambitious way for white to play. I'd rather sort of keep the space advantage and exchange the pawn. I'd rather play something like b3, bishop b2, and maybe try to get an e4 break eventually. But as one more example in the Catalan, just briefly looking at this position again, if say black does not play c6 but instead plays b6, now this is again is a lot more strong, because after e takes d5, say we just develop our pieces naturally, well it's a lot more difficult to develop your bishop outside the pawn chain this way now, because you probably will want your bishop on b7 to defend the d5 pawn, because if you develop your bishop like say out this way and play c6 to back up this guy, again, this sort of structure where you play c6 and you have the pawn b6, it's not so desirable, it's just sort of very, like, frail. But the other sort of situation which I find troubling that many players sort of play this move c takes d5 apart from the Catalan situation is this one of the semi-slav where people say they've blocked in, not just the semi-slav, but these subs in general, people who blocked in the bishop on this diagonal is playing a lot more of a passive role, and then they play c takes d5. This just is not it. Usually in the Carlsbad, to really make this sort of structure work, you're going to want your bishop on either f4 or g5 outside the pawn chain somewhere, because now when black again plays this move e takes d5, this I believe to be better than c takes d5, where you have this sort of exchange Slav structure, but even this is pretty decent for black, because again, white hasn't managed to get the bishop outside the pawn chain. But what I much prefer after c takes d5 for black is e takes d5, which sort of goes against that principle in a way of recapture towards the center. But again, what's more important is the fact we're opening our light square bishop on this diagonal, and we also can use the e file to sort of outpost our pieces on. You're going to see what I mean very quickly in this whole variation, where let's say white plays very passive moves like b3, we can play rook e8, bishop b2, knight e4, and when a bishop is on g5, of course, black rather, they don't have this option. It's an impossibility, your queen is hanging. But this time around, let's say like queen c2, queen e7, this knight is very solid on the e4 square. We can start swinging our pieces around to the king side and create like some serious attacking possibilities. We don't even have to do this. We could just play knight f8 even, bring the knight to g6, go bishop g4 again, bringing our light square bishop outside into the game. And these sorts of positions in practice score really poorly for white, because if you try and figure out what white's plan is, it's not very easy. They don't have a pawn break. Black has all the attacking ideas. Like maybe the only thing white can really do is pull off a really pathetic version of the minority attack where they start slowly playing a3, b4, but I just don't really buy it in this position. And also it's worth noting in this position, like pretty much the only active plan for white may be to play something like e4, but then after the following exchanges, what we come to realize is that basically white has an isolated queen's pawn and not a very good version of it. Like if you retreat the bishop, say bishop g4, maybe you could also play h6 or something to stop white from playing bishop g5, and I just do not find white's position remotely convincing at all. Where if you say went for the equivalent version of this sort of thing without playing this sort of exchange, let's say you played bishop d3, and of course the theoretical move for you semi-Slav people out there is to play d takes e4, bishop takes e4, b5, kicking the bishop away and then go with some sort of plan with a6, c5 eventually. There's also some other move orders like a6 first and then c5 with bishop d6. I think Sam Shankland recommended that. It might have been in this position after bishop d3. He recommended this. But let's say black instead plays this natural looking move, bishop d6, sort of following what we did in the other variation, castles, castles. Now white can play e4, but we have not exchanged off the c and e pawns, which has two benefits. One is that when we make all the exchanges, now we do not have an isolated queen's pawn. And two, because we have not exchanged off their e pawn for our c1, they still have the bishop locked inside the pawn chain. It's incredibly difficult to develop. They can't play b6 immediately, for example, because that just hangs the pawn. So again, like coming full circle, like what I just want to say, guys, is like really think about when you play c takes d5 with all the things we've talked about in this video going forward, like whether this is actually a good move or not. Don't just play it in autopilot and be like, oh, this is like a Carlsbad structure, I learned this in some like book I'm reading. You really want to be thinking about the move orders of how you're getting into that sort of Carlsbad structure, also the configuration of your pieces. My bishop on g2 slamming its head against this d5 pawn. Is my dark square bishop shut inside the pawn chain, unable to get out to a square like f4 or g5 where it's more active? These are all things which I found over the years I've been able to capitalize on quite well from like the black side, for example, because a lot of players, again, just do not understand what they are doing at all in these positions. But that being said, if you enjoyed the video, please drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. But that being said, I hope you guys all have a good day, and I will see you until next time.